making sure that there is a mutual learning between different communities is the ground on which then valuable collaborations between science and activism, or indeed embedding both roles in the same person, can thrive.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andrea Bandelli. This month's episode is about activism and science communication and whether they should be combined. There are obvious tensions here because science is meant to be as objective as possible, while activism is characteristically political and impulsive. But of course, there could be activists on both sides of a debate. There can also be incomplete or poorly reported science upon which that activism is based. On the other hand, could there be a role for scientists to guide activism, making it more rooted in fact, more strategic and more appealing in its approach? Andrea Bandelli is a science communicator and head of international relations at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He helps to unravel this topic, pointing out that activism need not be brutal and arguing for more overlap between science communicators and activists. To start off with, I asked Andrea to define some of the terms that are foundational to the conversation: science communication, activism, and advocacy.
I would start with science communication, which is a very big term because it comprises, in fact, a lot of different ways to connect the scientific endeavors and scientific enterprise with society. And already this is it's questionable because science is part of society. So it's important to avoid having a clash of different groups or different entities. Science is part of society as it's part of culture, but science communication is, however, a whole range of initiatives and ways to connect the scientific activity with members of society or parts of society that may be not directly involved in the scientific enterprise. And in particular, then there are also different. There is an evolution, say, of science communication. Also, if you look at the theory from just a one-way transfer of knowledge from science to citizens, it's been observed also that it's not really very efficient because even lay citizens or people outside of the scientific enterprise have knowledge, and therefore what is more valuable is to establish a two-way exchange where also the scientists can learn and take concepts from the public. But in fact, the more we go into advanced science and science that is more and more relevant and embedded in society, we see that in order to make advances, we actually need the knowledge of the different groups and the different stakeholders. So it's not even the communication, indeed, is not even more just the transfer of knowledge, but actually the creation of new knowledge. And in that sense, a lot of scholars and professionals talk about science engagement, for instance, or public engagement with science, which is one way of science communication. However, you also have in this science journalism, which is a very specific kind of science communication that is actually also investigating and looking critically at the activity of science. So it's a very broad concept, and I think it's always important to know that these terms like activism and advocacy, which we'll touch now in a minute, may represent different things to different people. Activism is, I'll tell you what I like about the word activism before going to definition. I really like the term act. So it's the action, is being active. And of course, activism is generally defined as taking action to bring social change or to address a social injustice. Many times and in many definitions, I find that this action is also very intense and almost sometimes brutal, which is probably what many people see in activism. But here also I'd like to remember, it's not always. So, brutal and almost violent. Activism can also be very persuasive, and it can be done in very kind and gentle ways. But important is that it addresses a social injustice, and through indeed action. So not only maybe this is the difference with advocacy. Advocacy is putting something on the agenda of the powers that be, to bring something to the attention of the policymakers, of the organizations, the institutions, where activism sometimes indeed takes things in their own hands. And there is, again, there a very broad range of initiatives where sometimes taking things in your hands means really disrupting the way of doing things. Sometimes it means indeed protesting in a very vivid and very visible way. And sometimes it means doing activities that are maybe much more indeed gentle and kind of under the radar, but they have that important impact in changing how things are, without waiting for the organizations and the institutions that are supposed to be responsible for that to bring that change.
One very small point of clarification. You mentioned that the goal was a social good, right? Or social change. So I just wanted to make sure that, just wanted to check how you include environment in that. So would you just include environmental under social sort of as a part of the sort of broader social good?
Well, my view would be that, first of all, the environment is the commons of everybody. So we all have indeed a duty as a society, regardless of where we are in the world, to take care of the environment. So I would say that first, indeed, at that level is a duty that we all have. And if we see indeed an injustice done to the environment, it is something that is indeed our duty as humans to address. And then there are also issues of environment injustice and social injustice due to consequences, basically, of environmental injustice can go much deeper into society.
Mm-hmm. It might also be a good idea to ask you for your brief answer to the question in the title of the episode, which is going to be something like, should science communication and activism be combined or not be combined, and why? So I think most of our discussion will probably be about the why, but I thought it might be a good idea to just sort of start off with like an elevator pitch short answer, just to sort of see, because I don't actually know exactly what you think, what your answer. I have a feeling, but I'm not completely sure. So if someone were to ask you in an elevator going down 10 floors whether science communication and activism should or shouldn't be combined, what would be your overview answer?
I would tend to say yes. Because science is a human endeavor, and therefore, as humans, there will be many instances where scientists shouldn't be afraid, at least, of being activists. Let's put it this way. I don't think that all scientists should be activists, not at all. But scientists shouldn't be afraid of being activists if they think that they're indeed human component, say, of being a scientist require them to do so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think now is kind of the time to pick that apart a little bit. And to start off with, I would say that one of the characteristics of science is its kind of relentless and dogged pursuit of objective truth, right? So I think any good scientist will admit that they're never actually going to get there, but still they're pursuing that. And the same presumably goes for science communication, right? Because that's simply the communication of that same science. But I guess that you would say that even if objectivity should remain an ideal, objective science communication is a myth. It's something that cannot really ever exist. So if you agree with me, could you expand on that or blow it out of the water?
Right. Again, it goes back to the fact that all these activities are done by humans, and we bring with us our own baggage of views and beliefs and limitations as well. And especially indeed when science and society are so intertwined, I think it's very difficult to first to remain completely objective, and also to pretend that we remain objective, because we are driven by passions, and even the choice of what to research or not. Sometimes it is indeed a result of our own passions. So in that sense, the method certainly is objective, but the overall, indeed, there is a lot of components that are intrinsically human. And therefore, when, for instance, when the knowledge that is developed by the scientific process is used for wrong purposes, as a scientist, can you stay indeed outside of that? Should you intervene? Can you intervene? And I think that also goes down to the fact of being citizens. Scientists are not robots. They are indeed humans. They are citizens. They are part of communities. And therefore, it is very important to acknowledge that, and to and not, indeed, as I said, not to be afraid. Not everybody has to do it, and it has, of course, consequences. Once being activist has, of course, consequences. But it's important not to, at least to unpack that fear and that feeling of discomfort that the world presents. And I think my interest in the topic is really, I'm always curious and fascinated by the initial feeling of discomfort that this creates, which means that it starts to move something inside people, and I find it very, very intriguing and interesting.
I heard a while ago some political commentators saying, and they were talking about journalism, not science journalism, but just journalism more generally. Mm-hmm. They were saying a similar thing about journalism. They're basically saying that no journalist is objective. All of them are writing and reporting with their own biases. But their point was that the important thing is that they don't try to hide those biases, mm-hmm. And that sometimes they should actually outright declare their biases. But at the very least, they should be aware of what those biases are, and not sort of try to not be sneaky about them. Mm-hmm. I would imagine that could be even more applicable in the case of science communication, especially when it is a controversial topic.
Yes, I think indeed it is. And I see that also, in fact, more and more often, that when science communicators are involved and present some issues and topics, they disclose also their own backgrounds and their own potential biases to make sure that human aspect is acknowledged, because it can also bring actually more value to the endeavor of science communication. A lot of science communication, for instance, is to be effective. It is based on storytelling. It is based on indeed human feelings and emotions, and therefore acknowledging that and creating also more powerful connections with the audience that we are interacting with can be very powerful. So definitely that is something good to do. And I'm thinking, now also thinking about biases, but maybe that's indeed a digression. I think it will become more and more interesting also to understand the role of AI into all this, because the role of biases and is something that now is one of the main concerns for AI. So maybe by disclosing our own biases, we'll also shed some light on how other systems can also be aware of their biases, and what do we do indeed with those biases.
Somewhat related to that, actually, I mentioned earlier on that this idea that the quest for objective truth is a characteristic of science. Another characteristic of science is its inherent uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about science, and one of the really misunderstood things about science as well.
Yes.
And so, science states probabilities and estimates the level of probability. And for those who know about science and are trained in the discipline, they'll know that a result is considered 95 or 99 or 99.9% probable. There's never 100%, right? And even results at the 99.9% level may sometimes be proven wrong later. That's why they're not 100%. So the question would be, how sure does a scientist need to be in order to be an activist about something or an advocate for something? Because, this goes back to kind of what you were saying right at the beginning. There's some kind of risk involved there, right? Because they're taking their understanding of the science or of their own science and kind of pushing it rather than sort of putting it out there for others to consider. They're sort of pushing that, and they're demonstrating a certainty, which is kind of a little bit contradictory to the whole scientific endeavor.
Yes. I agree with you. The beauty of science is that it is a continuous endeavor, and it is temporary knowledge. It can always be revised, but that is, of course, a very difficult concept for a lot of people who are actually seeking certainties and instructions. So what should we do? A or B? Well, so that is indeed one of the biggest struggles to make sense of that uncertainty. However, even in that uncertainty, there are consequences. So first of all, there are consequences which are, however, rather easy to predict and to ascertain. And therefore, when something, thinking a few years ago, indeed, with COVID, there was a lot of uncertainty, but there were also a lot of certainties. It is a communicable disease. So yes, regardless of the specifics of how it is transmitted among people. And the same indeed in the environmental field. There are a lot of practices that we know are negative. The fact that activists or advocates indeed use that scientific knowledge, this is indeed a very broad field. I would like to focus also on the cases where it is through the engagement with citizens and with people, say, outside of the strictly scientific endeavor, that we advance our own knowledge. And I'm not saying that this is more important. But that's the one where I'm fascinated, because you can only through the communication with people who are outside of your field, you can actually refine your questions and steer your research in ways that are meaningful and that can bring the conversation forward. In the medical field, for instance, there are examples where through the conversation with activists, the practice of clinical trials and medical trials has been changed and adapted to be much more responsive to the needs of society. And therefore, it is not a question of if the medicines works or not, but it's a question of the processes that we use now are, however, outdated and not relevant for the needs of today. So that is indeed where it becomes still, quite complex and complicated, actually, to realize that the uncertainty that scientists have is understood in very different terms by society. And I think that the art, if you want, is to make sure that that uncertainty is not communicated as a gap in knowledge, but as an opportunity to make actually change and to improve practices.
Mm-hmm. People, I guess they think about, not non-scientists, think about science in a similar way to how they think about politics, in the sense that a politician can never really admit they're wrong about something. That's kind of the end of their campaign if they admit a mistake.
Yes.
And science is, or people kind of judge science by the same measure, and it's just the bread and butter of science is this whole idea of certainty and levels of probability, levels of certainty, and improving and refining over time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If I understood correctly, you were also referring back to this idea of engagement rather than just straightforward communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
So engagement with society and this feedback mechanisms with society, which determine the course of science.
Yes, exactly. And there are several examples where, for instance, indeed, we're going back to what we were talking before about the way indeed science is shaped, the importance of the human component. I remember a very well studied example in the Netherlands, and it was from the medical field, but it was about burns, skin burns. Scientists were studying this as indeed from medical point of view, and they forgot basically, or they didn't investigate at all the pain that burns were doing. They were so interested into the regenerative powers and properties of skin and all of that. And it was only through the public engagement with patients that they found out that actually their priorities, the priorities of the researchers, were not the priorities of the patients at all. And therefore it questions also, okay, so why do you do that kind of research? If it's not, as a researcher, many were saying we do this to ultimately for the lives of the patients. But what they were doing were not the priorities of the patients. And I think that is a brilliant example that shows that without this engagement, you risk going into the different directions that ultimately do not serve society. Whereas by engaging and discussing and allowing multiple questions to be raised and discussions from all different points of view, you can put in sync the research activity with the needs of society or the stakeholders that you are addressing. And I find that indeed very fascinating. And sometimes these questions seem so obvious, but they are not raised during the research process. And I see that continuously in situations like and environments like science museums, where researchers speak with the public. Usually is a kind of science oriented public. It is, of course, very general, but and there, the kind of questions that are raised are so interesting. And many times the researcher says, "I never thought about that," even if it seems indeed so obvious. So I think there is a very powerful and very healthy discussion that happens in these situations.
Makes me think about also just the way you brainstorm with. It can be with colleagues about a scientific idea, or it can just be about an everyday issue, right? You always have some slightly different perspective that you never thought of, or some slightly different angle. That's why it always helps to speak to someone when you're struggling with something, right?
Right.
Same kind of thing, I guess.
Exactly. I think, and there are also others who have studied in the environmental field. There are also many of these situations where the societal value and benefit of research can be much stronger if it is done indeed in sync. And there are also a lot of competencies and knowledge that certain communities develop, knowledge that maybe is not codified and structured in the same way as scientists would do, but it is by no means less valuable or important. And by creating opportunities to bring the different communities and points of view in sync, you can add a lot of value to this.
I'm not sure how aware you are of this, but in the sort of international conservation, biodiversity conservation policy arena, this is in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity and IPBES, which is the kind of biodiversity equivalent of the IPCC. There's been a lot of emphasis recently for a few years now on involving Indigenous peoples and local communities and Indigenous and local knowledge into the discussion. And I've actually done a couple of episodes of the podcast where we've spoken about that. In that case, and I don't know if you want to get into this at all, but I find that in that case, there is the possibility of going too far in one direction. So there's kind of a tendency to treat Indigenous and local knowledge as more or less sacred. And whereas science is built to be torn down, that cannot be touched because of various political and societal sensitivities?
It is a very complex issue. I just want to remind actually that in the Journal of Science Communication, JCOM, in 2020, there was a series of commentaries about the role of scientists, science communicators, and activism and alternative science communication. And the whole idea was that activists and activist groups sometimes are seen as alternative science communicators. But one of the articles in that series of commentaries is exactly about what you were describing, the fact that climate change in certain indigenous communities really clashed with their understanding of climate that is given by indeed their gods. So it was really a very, very different level of discussion, because what we consider indeed science in that community is considered as religion. But what I find interesting there, however, is that, of course, these are also very delicate conversations. However, they can shed light to what happens in our society as well, because I'm also worried when I see that many conversations about science are brought to the level of religion. In our societies, you would expect that we should be above that. And therefore, maybe indeed going and looking into how other societies deal with this could actually be helpful for us as well, at least on understanding how to deal with these instances. And you see these examples, everywhere, and the consequences can be indeed extremely dangerous, from anti-vaxxers to climate change denial. And it's difficult to deal with this. Absolutely. These are very, very thorny and delicate and complicated situations. But I think in that sense, while I do get your point that it becomes indeed difficult and sometimes almost conflictual, if you want to bring all these points of view together, still that exercise could be useful. And that is where the theory of science communication, in fact, comes in, and probably also it's an interdisciplinary effort with anthropology and other disciplines. But this is something where the scientists who are looking at a specific issue could actually benefit from a deeper collaboration with science communicators, exactly to know how to deal in these situations.
I wanted to just to veer back a little bit more on the kind of science and activism combination side of things. It strikes me that, well, actually, let me just start off with a short story, which I've told on the podcast before. But some colleagues and I recently published an article in a peer-reviewed journal about the link between land change or land use change and land cover change and zoonotic disease spillover risk, right? Mm-hmm. So in the newspaper headlines, there'd been, all of these headlines, especially after COVID started, about the fact that deforestation and land degradation and all sorts of land change were causing diseases like COVID to break out. And so we kind of dug into the science a bit, and we found out that the empirical research did not support that conclusion very robustly, to cut a long story short. But the most surprising thing was actually that the secondary science, so commentary in the scientific journals, was closer, the bias was closer to the media than it was to the primary science. So I can't sort of explain what the reason is. Maybe they were affected by the media. Maybe they were not reading enough of the primary science or the literature reviews. I'm not sure. But that leads me to the question, if a scientist is being an activist about their own research, right, then I guess there's the danger that they could be biased because they have that sort of sense of ownership of their research. On the other hand, in most cases, they're probably basing it on a broader body of research, right? And there, the danger could be that they just might not be, even though they're reasonably familiar with it, they might not be as familiar as they need to be, to take the bold step of being an activist. Mm-hmm. So, Yeah, so the question would be, what about scientists' understanding of the science? In most cases, that information that fuels their activism or their advocacy is not their own results, but a compilation of decades of work. But I'd just be curious to hear what you think about that fact that scientists themselves might not understand the science all that well, and at the same time, so just to add one more point there, at the same time, having a PhD in front of your name gives you a certain credibility, right? And there's a responsibility involved there, because that means that whatever you say carries an extra weight, which it may or may not deserve.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think first of all, this is what you describe is exactly the situation where a scientist is a human being with their passion, with their feelings, their emotions, and implicitly or explicitly, this is part of their activity. I think there is also it's good for when scientists, however, get closer to the activism, because first of all, it creates a mutual learning process where scientists kind of speak a certain language, which is also given by the scientific method, and they have a process. Activists speak a different language, which often indeed is the one of social justice and of indeed changing systems. And many times these two languages are really very incompatible and very different. And therefore, a responsibility that scientists and activists as well can have is actually to have one foot in both fields, so that they can actually help to understand each other and to see that in order to bring the change that you need and to do the research that is meaningful and impactful, the first step is to be able to speak the same language. And that seems indeed very simple, but actually it's really very, very complicated and complex. And again, in the medical field, for instance, there is a very good example about this, which was in the 80s and 90s with the development of HIV medications, where activists started really to get into the medical process to learn that language and be able to speak with the medical field. I think the role of citizen science today, and this especially also in the environmental field, does something very similar. It allows indeed to find a common language between those who have the lived experiences in certain communities and the researchers. And what I see also, the value of citizen science is that it's not only the collecting data, but it's more and more actually shaping the research into a research. And therefore, it can be very valuable for researchers indeed to be acquainted and to step into that field to understand what are the boundaries also of their work, how to make sure also that their activist interest and passion remains compatible with the research activity. Because indeed, if it goes into a extreme kind of point, behavior, so then I think it could be seen as problematic. And there are several examples of that, and it doesn't have to reach that way, but making sure that there is a mutual learning between different communities is the ground on which then valuable collaborations between science and activism, or indeed embedding both roles in the same person, can thrive.
How much, excuse me, how much activism, and I'm thinking especially about environmental activism, but you can refer to that, or activism in general, but how much activism these days do you think is well informed? I suspect that quite a lot of it is not very well informed. But I think perhaps what you touched on there is that perhaps the involvement of scientists as leaders in that sense, sort of guiding those efforts and maybe making them more moderate in some cases, or simply better informed. I guess that's the main thing. Could make them appear more reasonable and more credible and more likely to succeed.
Yes, I think that would be good. The environment actually is a very interesting field because usually activism and science are on kind of opposing sides. Vaccine is an example. The activism, which unfortunately is for the anti-vaxxers, is indeed obviously in direct opposition to what the science says. Um, Whereas in the case of climate, activists actually are kind of on the side of science. And many times they will say, science actually is backing this up. It is probably the role of passions and the role of feeling of the lack of agency that is the problem. And therefore, in order to strengthen the agency that activists want to have in terms of being able to do some change, they hang on to certain scientific findings, and maybe the weakness is not to deal enough with the fact that knowledge indeed is transitory and it is going to be updating and is changing, and it is more complex than it seems. So I think it would be indeed definitely a field to investigate more in terms of understanding what could be the role of scientists to be less afraid of activism indeed, and bring both communities of activists and scientists to share more of the same language in order to achieve the advancements that are in the interests of both. This mutual fear is, and not only fear of each other, but also fear of the consequences, is a very, very important drive or block in the activity of scientists. And activists, in a sense, are more fearless, in a sense, but
and more certain as well, right?
Exactly.
And in one sense, at least.
Yeah, no, true, exactly. Yes, yeah. So there is indeed this very interesting dynamic there, which I think you pointed rightly, and I just think that it, especially with the experience that we have from fields where indeed activism and science are in opposition, environment could actually shed some light on, okay, how do we ensure that they go hand in hand. Previously, there were only some specific instances where this happened, like indeed the example of the development of HIV drugs, but those were indeed historically kind of located examples. Environment as a whole indeed is indeed much broader in terms of the learnings that we can get.
Do you have any sort of strong feelings or strong opinions on why activism, and I'm thinking again about environmental activism especially, but activism in general, why it's become so much more aligned with science? Because in the past, the vaccine example you gave is one example, but my sense is, sort of thinking back to the 90s and the early 2000s, activism and science seem to be much more separate than they are now. And I guess, I mean, my own answer to that would be that social media has probably got something to do with it. Some people say that the severity of the problem of environmental issues is a part of it. The fact that people are more aware of the severity of it. I'm not completely convinced of that particular reason.
Well, I think that there is a combination of factors. One is also the increase in general in education levels. I mean, we shouldn't forget that new generations, however, have indeed a much longer exposure to education, with changing social media, and the fact that indeed all these issues become immediately global and widespread is also important. I think also the crisis, however, of democratic institutions is also part of that, and therefore a need to be more active indeed, and that sense of agency that previously there was a much stronger trust that organizations and institutions would take care of societal problems, whereas now the trust indeed is being eroded, and therefore there is a natural tendency to step up and take things in their own hands. So all these issues together make so that we see an increase in the desire to have more agency and to cope basically with the inefficiency of organizations and institutions that were designed to deal with these issues, and they're not effective anymore.
Okay, that's it for this topic, at least for now. I don't yet have one lined up for next month, but I'm hoping to find a suitable guest to discuss the idea of whether capitalism or socialism is better for conservation and for nature. So that may or may not be the December topic. I have a couple of ideas lined up as well. In the meantime, I don't usually self-advertise, but if you like the podcast, please suggest it to others and comment or like or subscribe. The podcast has been growing quite nicely over the years, and monthly downloads have been increasing steadily. But I think there's still quite a lot of room for growth, which would be helped a lot by spreading of the word. Please also feel free to reach out through the contact form on the website, www.caseforconservation.com, using the number 4 between case and conservation. I do read and respond to all emails. I hope you'll join me next time.